Very much.
I call the Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, the irony of that contribution from New Zealand First is extraordinary when we look at the Hansard in September of 2008. Really? In the dying days of the Labour government, and I see New Zealand First's as new MPs are looking on in interest, I challenge them to read the Hansard in September in 2008. So far from championing against international instruments for dealing with climate change, the only reason the emissions trading scheme made it onto the books of the New Zealand legislator were the 5 votes recorded by New Zealand First to back Helen Clark's bill at that time. And that bill made broader instruments and had less control on international carbon units than the very bill that we have before the House right now, which actually puts greater restrictions on the use of those. I can only conclude that Alzheimer's is taking hold far worse than I thought within the New Zealand First caucus, and I'd just love Mr Peters to explain how it was that his decision to vote for that legislation was the only reason that an ETS made it onto the books. Mr Speaker, I also want to contrast the contribution that was made by Labour. Because in the 9 years that Labour was in government, they campaigned on New Zealand becoming carbon neutral. Remember the carbon neutral speeches? Remember every single bit of rhetoric we got in the House? I just want to... Well, the member says, Mr Clark, I think from Dunedin, says there was a plan. Well, there might have been. But let's talk about the results. Because when they came to government in 1999, New Zealand's emissions were 59 million tonnes per year. It'd be interesting to note how close they got to zero in their 9 years in government. Well, they actually went from 59 million tonnes a year to over 70 million tonnes in their 9 years. In fact, the most interesting fact is this. New Zealand's emissions during Labour's years grew faster than any other OECD country. New Zealand's emissions under Labour's jurisdiction grew faster than any other developed country, and we will not take on this side of the House Labour seriously with our own climate change until we hear some apologies for their appalling track record. And the two factors that contribute to Labour's record have both been turned around by this government. The first is that New Zealand has greater opportunities around renewable energy than any other country. Yet during Labour's years, in each and every year, the proportion of our electricity that was produced by renewables dropped. And I have to say, I think this government should be hugely encouraged that over our 4 years we have seen an increase in the proportion of renewables, and the figures that have just been published for 2011 show that it is at the highest level. And for those that want to bag New Zealand's record, I say let's be proud of the fact that New Zealand has a higher proportion of renewable electricity, levels that any European country would be jealous of, with only one exception, and that is Iceland. The second point that was absolutely tragic in the Labour years was the huge levels of deforestation. In Labour's years, there was more deforestation than in any government since the Great Depression. More deforestation. We have turned that around. The deforestation has stopped. The New Zealand forest area is growing, and that can be attributed to the sensible climate change policies that this government has been adopting. I want to commend the work of Tim Grosser, and I say this quite honestly to members of the House. New Zealand has never had greater influence internationally around climate change negotiations than under Tim Grosser's leadership. And anybody in this country who recognises that on this global environmental issue what New Zealand does is quite small should be hugely proud of the contribution that Tim is making to those international negotiations. I've been privileged to be at a couple of those with him. The way in which he has successfully getting the big players, the Indians, the Chinese and the Americans, to make progress on this issue is something that, frankly, every New Zealander, and certainly members of this side of the House, take pride. Mr. Speaker, on this issue, New Zealand needs to take a balanced approach. That is one of which we are doing our fair share as a country, but we also are realistic about the sort of pressure business and households are under. This bill does that. I look forward to working on the Select Committee to ensure the detail of this complex issue is worked through, but I cannot tolerate some of the double standards that we've seen both from Labour and New Zealand First members in this debate.
Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy to take a call on this. As we've been sitting here